Assistant Professor in European Studies and International Relations here at SAIS. I have the pleasure today to welcome Mr. Arnaud Danj and Professor Frank Gavin. Arnaud Danj is a member of the European Parliament with the European People's Party. He was elected in 2009 and he's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, and since 2009 he's been presiding the subcommittee on security and defense until 2014. So his links with the defense world were developed before at the national level, as Mr. Danj was a civil servant in the External Intelligence Service, DGSE, from 1994 to 2002, where his work focused especially on the Balkan region. Given his expertise on defense and security issues and his dual European and French career, it is only logical that President Emmanuel Macron tasked Mr. Danj with chairing the drafting committee for the strategic review of security and national defense that was released in late October. So we're talking obviously the French strategic review for security and defense. Thank you very much, Mr. Danj, for choosing to come to talk to SAIS today during your short visit, I think, for a meeting of the EU-US Interparliamentary Session. Also with us today, so Professor Frank Gavin, who's the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor and the Director of the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs here at SAIS. Previously, he held the first Stanton Chair of Nuclear Security Policy Studies at MIT and was a professor in international affairs and the director of the Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. Frank Gavin is also involved with numerous other institutes on nuclear and strategic issues, including managing the Atom Program at Harvard Belfer Center, with the Roger Wilson Center, as well as the Council on Foreign Relations. And his publications include Nuclear Statecraft, History and Strategy in America's Atomic Age, published at Cornell University Press in 2012. So this is just to name a few of his many academic achievements. So thank you very much, Frank, for joining us today in this discussion. So I will first leave the floor to Mr. Danj to present the strategic review, and then we're going to engage on a conversation with Frank, and then open up to Q&A. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I took a cold, not in Washington, because obviously winter is not there yet, but no. It's the case in Europe, so sorry for that. Well, thank you for hosting me today. I'll try to be as brief as possible so that we can let space for questions, because the review is quite a massive report, so I won't go into too much into details, but then we can answer questions, of course. Maybe a short word on how it was designed and the methodology. Thank you for flattering comments on the way that it was logical that I was picked up to chair this review, but it was not that obvious, at least to me, because it came as a surprise. The request from the Minister of Defense, but the strategic review is something new in France. Actually, we used to have white books, white papers. We had two in 2008 and 2013, which are more comprehensive exercises. But the new executive in France, President Macron, once he was elected, wanted something shorter. He wanted something quicker in order to readjust the French military strategy and the means attached to it as soon as possible. Because when we look at the previous white book, the last one in 2013, what we see is that it was obviously a very good work, very relevant, but all the recommendations of this book had already been, how could I say, overstretched a few years after it has been, only a few years after it has been written. So what we assess, for example, is that the operational commitments of the French armed forces were exceeding already by 20 to 30% what had been foreseen in 2013. So we had to refresh this, not to mention the fact that between 2013 and today, a lot of things have happened in our strategic environment. And whereas the White Book of 2013 would have focused on the economical and financial crisis affecting Europe and then affecting also the military budget, we had the Arab Springs, and we did not have at that time the wave of terrorism we had experienced in Europe in 2015 and 16. We did not have invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, so massive events. We did not have even the French military intervention in Sahel, which happened in January 2013, which means when the White Book was conceived, it had not happened yet. So many events had happened in the vicinity of Europe and obviously affecting our strategic environment. So therefore, there was a need for a refreshment. But the president wanted something lighter than a White Book. In two sense. First, in terms of time frame, whereas usually a White Book is designed in 8 to 9, 10 months with a very comprehensive approach, a lot of hearings and quite numerous committee. We had a committee with 18 members, and we had 3 months to deliver our paper. So that's a major difference. The second major difference, which is even bigger and more important, is that we had to we had to describe the strategic environment and to tell what it means for our armed forces in terms of adapting our armed forces. But we did not have to go into details when it comes to the capabilities, which was a major difference with the previous White Book. The White Book had to set up what we called in French the contrat opérationnel, so the operational commitments, with very, very detailed capability planning. Like we need for 4 theater of operation, we need tanks, I don't know, I would tell you 20 tanks, 10 combat jets, and so on. It's absolutely not the case with the paper we handed over to the president last October. We do not go into that level of details. In a way, what we did is in an introduction to the bill, which is being prepared right now and will be discussed in the Parliament in spring 2018, that will allocate the means for each staff, for the Army, for the Navy, for the Armed Forces, for the Air Force, and for also intelligence agencies. That will come afterwards. But what we had to do is to make, I would say, the strategic introduction to that allocation. The main messages of the review, if you have the opportunity to read it, and I'm sorry we couldn't have it in English, we have just a summary in English, I think, available on the website of the Ministry of Armed Forces, but the English version will be available in a few days, I think, I hope. You will see there is nothing very original in it. I mean, when we describe a lasting unstable environment, I mean, it's not a big surprise. But it's always better to describe it explicitly. So I think the most interesting thing is not what we describe about the current situation, even though we put an emphasis on some phenomena which had been described previously, but not to the extent that we did. For example, about the jihadist terrorism, I think we do have some quite well-articulated development on what it is, why it will last, what it will be a lasting challenge for our societies and not just for our armed forces, where it will probably spread, and why military defeats currently happening in the Middle East will not mean the end of this main challenge. But we wanted to go beyond that. One of the obstacles we would face was that this phenomena, terrorism, is so massively, violently, dramatically affecting our societies that we would not take into consideration other threats, which are seen as maybe more virtual, more far away from us. And we could have been led to neglect somehow other challenges. So we had to be as comprehensive as we could because I think in the future our security might be affected by things we don't see very clearly right now. That was, for example, the case with space dimension, and we pay a lot of attention to that specific challenge. What happened in the space, militarization of space, space without any regulation, space in which you have state actors very active, but also non-state actors now developing activities, commercial activities, but which could turn into activities affecting our security system in the near future. This is something we have to take into account. Cyber, of course, is something which is not new in itself. I mean, but the impact it has on our societies, on our armed forces, is something crucial. So we had to pay a lot of attention to that. But also more classical, I would say, conflict and crisis all around Europe. I mean, we are a continent surrounded by crises, conflicts, and wars. So we had to describe each of these crises, but we wouldn't. I think it was important to go beyond that and to see what can happen in the future. Not only by listing geographically the areas where you can have eruption of violence tomorrow, because there you're almost sure to miss something. But what was important for us is to describe the new patterns for conflicts. And we listed some very interesting phenomena, like ambiguity. We are now in a world where the way different powers are, if there are states, non-state actors, are interacting in crisis is more ambiguous. What is an aggression? What is a lone action? What is something which is subcontracted by a state to individual like actors? You know, the difficulty of identifying who is doing what, who is attacking you, for what purpose. This ambiguity is something very important that makes our work, I mean the work of all security forces very difficult. Because you have to identify, you have to measure, you have to assess very clearly where it comes from, what is the purpose, and what can be the reaction you might develop, what is also the way to deter some actions. So, of course, you would call that maybe hybrid. This is a vocabulary we don't like too much. We find it a bit, how can I say, a bit, I mean, this is not precise enough. And hybrid as such is not something new. I mean, you mentioned in my career, intelligence career, I served mainly in Yugoslavia. What Milosevic did in the 90s in Yugoslavia was very much hybrid warfare with propaganda, with paramilitaries, with intelligence activities. So, I mean, hybrid as such, you know, combining different type of activities to reach a military goal, it's not something new. But of course, it has developed to such a scale that it is now something in itself which is problematic. But we better had the word of ambiguity, the concept of ambiguity, to sum up a bit this new phenomena. Also, together with ambiguity, you have the what we would call a tougher operational environment. What we witness now everywhere where our forces are engaged is that our enemies, adversaries, are developing military capabilities with, I would say, a better access to sophisticated technologies and probably a way to use force which is with no inhibition. Can we say that in English? Yeah, without any complex. That you have now state actors, but non-state actors. Of course, everybody thinks about Daesh, but it could be also the case with some state actors that will go to war and use violence without any limit. And this is something relatively new. When you think about, for example, the respect which was until probably Afghanistan and Iraq, with which humanitarian personnel were treated, Red Cross personnel, you wouldn't attack them. There were laws and there was some respect of the humanitarian law. This has disappeared. I mean, in every conflict now, they become even priority targets. So this use of violence, massive use of violence, with new technologies, accessible to even non-sophisticated actors, will make our operational environment tougher. And this has huge implication, of course, for our forces. The Western technological and I would say somehow doctrinal superiority has gone. We're living in an environment where it's more equal for different forces, and I'm not sure we are well adapted to that new configuration. We also pay big attention to the military competition, and the military competition is now spread to an extent probably unprecedented, because it's not only in phase of conflict that you have this military competition, but you have also for the access of common goods. So maritime zones, the space, cyber, of course territorial activities, you have now competition everywhere to gain access and to gain control and to assert control on zones which were, I would say, free zone until now. And it especially is the case and problematic in space, because there is no regulation, once again, and this will prove problematic in the future, but also in the maritime domain, because you know that when it comes to trade, trade activities depend very much on the liberty to sail, I would say, to move in the oceans, and this is under threat clearly now, because you have assertive policies from a lot of states, but also non-state actors. And look at what the Houthis are doing, for example, from the shore of Yemen. They can block the maritime circulation in this part of the world, or what the pirates did off the coast of Somalia, prompting a huge military deployment from EU and from NATO. It was already 10 years ago. So this is a very concerning development. All in all, the world we describe is, of course, unstable one, more unpredictable, which is also problematic. And also we stress the problem of the destruction, and to a large extent deliberate one, of the multilateral order. We know, of course, the limit of the multilateralism. I mean, the instruments of the United Nations are not always efficient, to say the least. They suffer a lot of shortages, but we still believe in France that they are indispensable, that you cannot envisage a world without any regulation. And even though all the tools we had at our disposals have not proven always efficient, to say the least, once again, having them almost systematically bypassed, undermined, destroyed even, is something very problematic, because it's not only about the UN system, it's about the whole security architecture. And we do live that in Europe, especially. What happened in Ukraine, I mean, it's tragic for Ukraine itself, but it's also so damaging for the architecture, security architecture. It's not about only a war or a conflict or an invasion. It's about violating agreements, international agreements. It's about despising and bypassing all security agreements and all organizational agreements you have in OSCE or such kind of organizations. So this is very concerning to us, and we do believe that unfortunately too many actors are now involved in dismantling this multilateral architecture. And we do consider that very problematic. Also, once again, we have no illusion about the fact that the peacekeeping operation of UN, for example, we are suffering a lot of shortages, that the mandate are not robust enough, that the contributions are not well designed, and so on and so forth. But it's better with than without. And if we don't have something to do better or to replace, that will prove very dangerous in the near future. Having said that, on this environment, with lasting threats and new threats emerging, and a very unstable environment, what does it mean for French forces? We do insist on the fact that there is a French strategic singularity. And we do say that without any arrogance. It's not. It's just that we do consider that combining nuclear deterrence, independent nuclear deterrence, combining a full spectrum armed force, which does act. It's not just on theory. We do fight wars right now. We have more than 10,000 personnel involved in different theaters combating, combat troops. It's not just stabilization force, or it's combat troop in Levant, in Sahel. So this is something which is not that common among Europeans especially. So nuclear deterrence, full spectrum acting armed forces, and also wanting to retain this capacity of intervention, being ready to do so, having an institutional system which is very specific as well. We are probably the only democracy where the decision-making process is that short in terms of military intervention. I mean, it's purely executive. If the president decides, it happens. The parliamentary dimension is marginal. So I don't say it's good or bad, or we can discuss that forever. I mean, and I do respect other systems, but we have to take that into consideration. We have this system, and it makes us specific compared to many partners. And sometimes it can be a disadvantage, by the way, because it makes us also difficult to adjust to other decision-making process. And we have some misunderstandings with our partners on the fact that we would like them to be maybe sometimes quicker and more robust in their reaction, military reaction, whereas we do act so quickly on our own. So so these are pieces of our strategic singularity. We want to keep it. We want this strategic autonomy to be at the core of our ambitions, being fully aware that autonomic strategy, which is a very French concept, I admit, this strategic autonomy does not mean that we want and we can do everything alone everywhere at any time. It's just that we do have this ambition. Given the complexity and of the environment, given the probability of crises around us affecting our own security interest, we have to be able to assess, to decide, and to act alone if needed for our own security. That does not mean that we will do that systematically alone, but we have as much as possible, as much as we can, to keep this ambition. Because, as I said, decision-making process of partners can be longer, can prove more difficult. Look at what happened on Syria, for example. Look at what happened on Mali. Even if we wanted, maybe we wanted to go alone, but even if we wanted to go with others, others could have come only long after us because they did not have the same process. So we had to act alone. We have to keep this capacity. But strategic autonomy, is mainly about assessing the situations independently. Where we want to act, with whom we want to act, which modalities we want to take. This has to be assessed as much in autonomy as we can. So this is an ambition we have, but we are fully aware that it does not mean that we are capable of doing everything alone. We're perfectly aware that what we are undertaking, for example, in Sahel, we couldn't do that without some American assistance, especially in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, where we have some shortages. We have to admit that. We have to admit that when it comes to the space dimension, it's very difficult to act alone, given the budget you need, given the technology you need, given the interest you have to share with other partners. So there are many fields in which we are perfectly aware that the strategic autonomy does not mean 100% sovereignty. But it has to be well assessed, and it has to be mutual beneficial cooperation, allowing a share of responsibility. But we don't want to give up some capabilities without being certain that we can have them in common with others and that we have them at our disposal at some point. We have some partners which we are very close to, for example, Brits, that have deliberately given up some capabilities a few years ago. What they discover now is that they would like to retake them, but it's a very high cost. It's very problematic. Once you have given up a capability in military terms, it's highly unlikely that you will recover it at some point, or it will be at such a cost that we will probably have to sacrifice something else. We don't want, as much as we can, we would like to avoid this dilemma. So we want to keep as much as we can. But it's also part of the nuclear deterrence. I did not talk about nuclear deterrence because it was not the core of the review, because the decision has already been taken by the president to keep our two components of the nuclear deterrence. So we did not have to put that into question. So we do mention nuclear deterrence because it's still something very strong in the French defense strategy, but we did not develop that into details. But it's true that technologically speaking, operationally speaking, and I would say doctrinally speaking, the nuclear deterrence plays a great role in shaping our strategic autonomy. Because obviously this is something fully sovereign. So we do insist on that, and I will maybe end this presentation, and sorry if it's a bit confused, I did not prepare it. We have two recommendations which are a bit new maybe compared to other French strategic books. The first one is when we talk about the strategic functions shaping our model. We have 5 strategic functions: deterrence, prevention, protection, intervention, intelligence. I mean, anticipation, knowledge, which is intelligence, basically. I put aside nuclear deterrence, which is something on its own, which is, I would say, untouchable. We had, among the 4 other functions, one which was, over the last decade, I would say somehow privileged over the others, was intervention. Because of what we had to deliver. Intervention was very much the focus of the main capability, efforts, and capacities. It has changed a bit. I mean, intervention is still very high, but we want to rebalance the whole articulation between these 5 functions. And we pay particular attention to prevention. Prevention meaning all the, I would say, combination and with all non-military dimension, making a non-intervention or an intervention successful. In other words, and it was expressed by the militaries themselves, military means only cannot allow to achieve the goal of preventing a crisis or solving a crisis. And it's very important. I mean, it's lessons learned from observation of previous engagement in which we were not part for all of them. Iraq, we were in Afghanistan, but we were not in Iraq. We are now in Iraq, but also what we are experiencing in Africa, and especially in the Sahel. And one of the important lessons we are learning is that even if we face a security threat, the way to handle them has to involve other actors, non-military actors, non-security policies, and it has a great impact on what we can achieve. It seems, I mean, it sounds obvious. This comprehensive approach has long been advocated by many. I'm a member of the European Parliament. We have hundreds of reports talking about the comprehensive approach. It was a kind of a flagship of the previous High Representative, the comprehensive approach. We heard that every day. But I just realized that we're talking a lot about that. When we have to implement it on the ground, it's far from obvious. And I'm not sure that we did it, actually. And I'm even sure that we did not do it successfully so far in many regions. So we do insist on that because we believe that the complexity and the simultaneity of the crisis we will face now will require this kind of approach. And once again, it's a review dedicated for armed forces, but it was a claim from the armed forces themselves to include and to integrate these views. And I think when we had the conversation in the Pentagon preparing this review, it was also a case made by the US military that we can do a lot, but we cannot do everything. And now the crisis we are facing, they have a lot of implications, of dimensions we cannot handle by ourselves and by military means. So prevention is something very important. Another aspect is also, of course, and which was not entirely new in our review, but I think it's the first time that there is such a large space dedicated to it, was cooperation. Cooperation with our European partners. So there is clearly a European ambition in our defense policy now, which is perfectly spelled out. I mean, we are absolutely explicit on this. And also, of course, with other partners, global partners, be it the US, which remains a nation, essential ally, but also in Pacific Ocean, for example, with an Indian Ocean. We have a lot of be developed. So we do explicitly talk about that. And when it comes to the NATO and EU cooperation, we have a very pragmatic approach. On the one hand, we perfectly assume that we are member of both organizations, and we want to play fully our role in both organizations. No doubt about that. And I think for those who were expecting, this old debate, theological debate in France about being part of NATO, fully, not fully, this debate is closed. We are full member of NATO, and that's it. And we will play our role within NATO, and no doubt about that. And the kind of deployment we have, for example, in the Baltic states, is a proof of that. And it will remain. It will continue. And I think that will be one of the very concrete lessons of the review already. That politically speaking, we will continue this commitment. But we want also to be flexible, which means if we can develop cooperation within NATO and within EU, fine. And we will do that the most we can. If it has to go through other formats, why not? We are perfectly aware, for example, that developing ambitious programs or operations within the European Union framework at 28, 27 without the UK in the near future is not that realistic. So the inclusiveness of EU policies are politically fully legitimate. I'm not sure it's compatible with efficiency. And so if we want to deliver on many aspects, we will have to work with those who are able and willing. So this concept of able and willing is very much at the core of our flexibility perspective. And once again, it's not detrimental to the organizations themselves. We will respect fully EU, NATO, but if there are opportunities to do things which do not fit exactly with the perimeters of these organizations, but would prove beneficial for the partners and for our security, we would do it without any complex. That's what the President Macron explained in his own words after the review, or during the review, by proposing a European intervention initiative. It does not match exactly with current EU tools, but it is something that can be even larger than the EU. You can have Norway participating. You can have UK tomorrow participating without being member of the EU. But it's a way to aggregate those who really want and feel able to deliver more efficiently in the field of defense. So this flexibility, pragmatism is something relatively new in our approach, and is something which once again we want to combine as much as we can with the full membership of NATO and EU, but also with global partnership. I would mention Australia, for example, which is a key partner for us. And some other countries in Asia Pacific, and showing also that we will remain committed to our international obligations. Of course, our immediate priority is the southern flank of the Mediterranean, because this is where we interact. It's obvious. I mean, we have security interest. We are affected directly by the situation in the south, and this is where we are still able to act alone if needed. But we don't neglect other areas where we cannot play the same kind of role, but still we have an international obligation. We're still member of the UN Security Council, and we're fully aware that even if we have limited resources, we have also overseas territories, we have presence abroad, and we have partnership, and we want to play our role even for example, Asia Pacific, Indian Ocean. These are places where our security interests are also affected by the current developments. I'll stop there. I'm sorry I was a bit too long and probably too confused, but these are the main
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Frank, do you want to react?
Sure. Lots of fascinating details, lots of things that I would love to know more about, but just sort of three broad general reactions of both to your presentation, and I had the honor of hearing you at Brookings as well, and then brushing up on my incredibly rusty French and reading the document, and then some of the commentary, excellent commentary, including a terrific piece that Alice wrote for War on the Rocks, which was fantastic, and I'd recommend for anyone who's interested.
One of the best I read so far.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely. Well, she's our budding superstar here. So, War on the Rocks. It's excellent. So, three reactions. The first is, and again, anyone who knows me knows I'm not very inclined to flattery, but I was incredibly impressed both by this document and the process. And I say this coming through two lenses. One, running a center named after Henry Kissinger, thinking about how one develops grand strategic perspectives, thinking about the balance of power, thinking about means and ends, and also thinking about the process that the United States goes through, and the comparison between our national security strategy and this, I would suggest, does not make our national security strategy process look very impressive. Just this week, we're being told that the NSS was approved. We had the Nadia Shadlow's terrifically smart person, but come by and brief our students on the NSS. And I'll just say that compared to the strategic review that you've shepherded, the process that the U.S. government goes through this, even in the best of times, is problematic. We talked about this earlier, but here's a document that sets out strategic priorities in order then to determine what is purchased, where things are deployed. There's just a natural relationship between the strategy and then what's done to implement the strategy. Well, here in the U.S., the NSS is not done that way. The QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, is almost a completely separate process. We produce this document every 4 years, and when you read it, there's even in the best of times, a lot of pablum, not the sort of sharp distinctions and prioritizations. And so the first thing I would say is that this is a very impressive exercise, and it's a very impressive document. And I would love to know more about what is, frankly, a very unusual process and what we could all learn to do this. Because, as you know, countries around the world are doing these national security processes. From what I can tell, most of the time they produce just sort of pablum, right? But this is actually very, very impressive. So I would highly recommend people look at this, and I think it's important to think about what the process is that led to it. Now, this is my second point, which is what is oppressive about it. There is a balancing between this, in a very Kissingerian way, the core vision, the grand strategic framing, also combined with pragmatism and flexibility, right? It's very, very impressive, right? So there's no, a lot of times in particularly American documents, you'll see, well, it's all about problem solving without the strategic vision or without the general sense of what is framing things. And as you pointed out, what is the strategic environment in the world? And this document, and the way you've laid it out, very nicely balances, here's a core set of strategic principles that emanate from France's interest in the world, which are unshakable, right, and which we aren't going to sacrifice, while at the same time recognizing the ability to implement them in a very practical way. And there's sort of three particular ways that I saw that this was really, really interesting. First was on the temporal perspectives, right? You very nicely talk about this overwhelming threat of jihadism while recognizing it's very important in a strategic document not to be overwhelmed by that. And frankly, we have failed in the United States to be able to do that in either our documents or our policies. And so that's very, very impressive. While recognizing the looming, unbelievable threat in front of you, while also making sure it doesn't crowd out medium and longer term strategic threats. So that's very impressive. The second thing is a balance between the traditional geographic, geopolitical concerns and what we might call the new threats, whether it's cyber, new domains. I agree with you, hybrid is a problematic. I like sort of wrestling with the notion of ambiguity. But balancing between the fact that in some ways great power politics has returned, as we see in the Ukraine, as you mentioned, as we see in a rising China. But on the other hand, recognizing that much of even the actors are different, the tools that they use are different, and this sense of ambiguity, which I think is a very important one, and I hope that we get back to it. And the third aspect of that is this autonomy versus partnership. In the previous meeting, you had this great phrase about dropping the theological disputes about France's role in NATO, whether there's going to be a European army, who the partners with, and being very sort of practical about recognizing that different problem sets will demand different partners, and that is very impressive. I think the third thing that I think is very interesting, and it doesn't come out explicitly, but is very striking when you look at this. I think one of the great untold stories of the past decade or so has been the increasing cooperation and collaboration between the United States and France. Right? This has flown very much under the radar screen, right? And we all have these images of 2002 and 2003. When in fact, the level of cooperation and collaboration has, and in some ways, I was having a conversation with a former Bush administration official that came to our class, and he said, in many ways, you can argue that the special relationship, there's obviously intelligence issues here and the whole Five Eyes question, and we should talk about that, but that if you really get down to it, especially post-Brexit, and especially how Macron has handled Trump, he's up there with some of the world leaders who have figured this out about how to handle him, that this is only going to increase, right? And both in terms of overlapping shared interests, and I would actually say a view of the world, and also complementary capabilities, right? Whether it's special operations, whether it's extraordinary intelligence cooperation, that this is really an untold story, and it's fascinating. Neither side want to, for lack of a better term, trumpet it, right? But it's there, and it's real, and it's increasing, and it comes through. Even, it's very interesting. I'm very interested in Alice's view on this, but when you discussed China, when you talk to, say, German officials, it's all through the lens of money, trade, and markets, right? And so you say, but very little of this recognition of, and this is when you go to Japan and you talk to people in Tokyo, what is wrong with the Germans? Why are they doing this to us? Why is Merkel not visiting us? Why are we? Yet in the French conception, there's a recognition. Obviously, this is a growing power. Obviously, they have an interest, but more of an alignment with a sort of a U.S. view that this is a region that matters. It's not clear what China is up to, whether they're going to play in this order or not. And so again, I think that's one of it's unspoken, it's not explicit, but I think it's really, really important and fascinating. It should be talked about. There's three questions that I would have. The first is, I'm absolutely fascinated by how you came to this position and how this great document was produced, right? It's so at odds, just kind of picked out, and then to produce something so good. I think my second question is, you talked about the shifting focus on prevention. That sets off some alarm bells, because I think about the 2002 National Security Strategy, and when the U.S. talked about prevention, what does prevention mean? It's one of those terms that can be tricky. And then I think the third issue, sort of putting on my Kissinger hat, and this is something I was actually telling him about this because I saw him yesterday, and we had a long conversation about, because your focus on the undermining of the multilateral order got me thinking about the Kissingerian theme about the legitimacy of the order, right? So we all talk about shifting balances. Everyone knows it's there. But I think what comes out really nicely in this document is that the sort of post-45 order, even the post-11-9 order, the legitimacy of it is under threat. We don't necessarily have a replacement. And so my question would be is, how did this come up, and what do you envision either strengthening that order or augmenting it or even replacing it in some sense? But overall, just an extraordinarily impressive document.
Well, thank you so much. I was not expecting so nice words. I mean, maybe because also it was not that easy to have this document, so it was very intensive. But all in all, we had quite easy convergences. But I appreciate your words, and I will forward that to the committee, because that's collective work. Modestly, I was probably the least qualified person in the committee. I mean, I had 17 other people, and all of them were top people in each capacity, and that's probably why we ended up with something of good quality, because really we had good inputs. We had also these time constraints, which proved beneficial for the quality of the work, because we had to go straight to the point. And that's the way I was chairing also the debate. But frankly, it was also because we had so little time to achieve this. We did not have time. We love in France debating, discussing, theological debate. We did not have time for that. So I would always remind people, straight to the fact, straight to the point, which leads me to another remark on the style, I would say. But it also affects the substance of the text. I wanted something as objective as possible. I didn't want to spend hours and lines on, is Russia an enemy or an adversary I don't care. This is not really the problem. I mean, the problem is to qualify what they did, what they do, and just to keep to the fact. And the fact speaks for themselves, I would say. But if we were embarked in how to qualify China, how to qualify the U.S. administration with Trump, I mean, we would have ended up with impossible debates. We would have wasted so much time, energy, concepts, and I wanted to remain straight to the fact. That's why we have this form of a document, and you won't find intentional, blame or something. We want what is problematic in terms of strategy and consequence for our armed forces, what is problematic with the Russian attitude, with the Chinese attitude, with some partner attitude, and this is it. And we didn't want to enter into debate. So that explains a lot also about the work. And I would say also that this is also why the document is very pragmatic. First, because the president himself is a very pragmatic person, and he wants to have this print on his foreign policy. And he said that explicitly from the very beginning. He wants a pragmatic approach. So of course, it has an impact on the work we did. When it comes to why I was picked up, I don't know, actually. You have to ask the question to the president. But very modestly, when I'm in France, I'm labeled as an Atlantist, which is not always a compliment. When I'm in Brussels, I'm labeled as a sovereignist, a French nationalist. And when I'm in Washington, I'm labeled as a Europeist, Europeanist, or I don't know how you say that. Maybe, I would say paying too much importance to the strategic autonomy of the Europeans and not being enough a NATO guy. So which probably means that I'm quite balanced and pragmatic myself, and based on concrete experience. So it's also kind of a philosophy that is present in this document. But most of the people that were around the table, the member of the committee, are sharing this approach. Some were more ideological, but all in all, we had very experienced people and people who wanted to go straight to the facts. So it explains a lot about the process, and also the fact that we wanted openness. We wanted to be firm on our base and on our core principles, but also openness to explore new perspectives, and especially when it comes to partnership cooperations, we wanted to be a bit innovative, and we will see if it can materialize. But at least we wanted to open some doors. Prevention, you're right. Prevention is probably not the right word to describe what it is about. It's not only prevention, because it's also different dimensions, even when the crisis has occurred and the conflict is there. So it's accompanying the crisis. It's this comprehensive approach. This is an expression I've heard so much without concrete action that I still have difficulties to use it, and I don't like it that much. But I do not have more precise word to describe what it is about. It's really the fact that, and we have this experience right now in the Sahel. It's very striking. We start with fighting jihadism. It's a fully legitimate. We managed. We had military success. But what come afterwards? Stabilizing society. It's not even nation building. It's a bit different than that. It's stabilizing a situation. It's also avoiding resumption of terrorism and jihadism. We have the case in Afghanistan. We have the case in Sahel. I mean, there are many differences. I don't like analogies, but still, I mean, we have these problematics, and we obviously we see that you can spend a lot of military resources. You can deploy thousands of troops. You can have the best tactics. You can have good intelligence. It's not enough, and you're not sure of succeeding. Far from that, and you can even have very bad surprises. So we have to combine, and with civilian aspects, we have to combine with different policies, and of course development is one of them, diplomacy, governance. It's easier said than done. I think that's the most crucial challenge, because it's all about, and you use the word in another respect, but I combine the two questions. It's all about legitimacy. What we did, for example, in Mali is fully legitimate when you take into account international law, when you take into account violation of sovereignty, of territorial integrity by armed forces, by a terrorist group. It's perfectly legitimate regarding the agreement we had with the country. So no doubt about that. So we start with a fully legitimate action, and we end up nowadays with a tricky situation where we could soon become a kind of an occupation force, where we don't exactly know who is the enemy now, because it's easy in principle. It's very complicated, practically speaking, but it's easy to determine who is the enemy when you have jihadists claiming themselves as jihadists and acting like this and being among themselves. Now the situation we have is much more complicated. We have communities, armed forces, armed groups. Are they jihadists? Opportunistically, yes, somehow, but the real purposes are not exactly religious or spreading jihad. It's also community rivalries. How do you act in that? Should we act? Should we act in that? I don't know. I mean, it's very complex. And then you have a lack of governance. You have a failed state. This requires global action. Because if we don't do that, the military part of what we do, which has proven legitimate and efficient, will turn into a disaster, potentially. So, and that's why the military themselves are the first to ask for that and to tell us we cannot achieve that alone. So help us, because we do the best we can, but there are things we cannot achieve. And this matter of legitimacy is crucial. And I think on this, this is a key issue. I don't have the answer. I would say this is the challenge of life. I mean, we have gone through different periods where humanitarian interventionism was very fashionable and proved efficient. I would not say that all military intervention led to bad situations. On the contrary, I think some were necessary and did work. But we're in another phase now. It's more complicated, more complex to intervene. It prompts a lot of reaction, and you cannot isolate one crisis from another. I mean, Yugoslav crises, for example, were very complex in themselves, but you could isolate from other parameters. You could deal with them. What was difficult was to put everybody together to intervene at the same time with the same objective and to do it effectively. But once it was done. And you could, isolate this theater from other. Now you move a piece in Mauritania, it has an impact on Syria, which has an impact on Iran. I mean, the simultaneity of the crisis and of the actors makes things very much more complex. And the political dimension of all this and the diplomatic dimension of all this is indispensable. Otherwise, you fail and you send troops and it's endless. So we have to be aware. So you're right, you're perfectly right. It's not about just prevention, because it's even more after the crisis has erupted. But it's everything which is not military before, around, and after a military intervention, I would say. Put it that way, maybe, to be more explicit. And on the world order and multilateralism, I do take your point, and this is a debate we had, because to some extent, in our group, I thought that sometimes we were too conservative. Like, we have to stick to multilateralism as it was defined in the UN Charter and so on. And my average observer was like, hey guys, just wake up. We won't come back to business as usual. World has changed, and why international should not change? Because some claims from some actors who are contesting the order are legitimate as well. I mean, we cannot live forever with something that has been built on a Second World War. So we have to take that into account. So it has to move. President Macron, I think, made a speech in which he talked about the necessity to be creative when it comes to reshaping international order. So I would not say that we have to stick at any cost to something which has already proven, how can I say, dépassé, outdated, sorry, yeah. Thank you. Outdated. So it would be ridiculous. I mean, and it would be arrière-garde, and then we would achieve nothing, and we would just be here to complain, and we lose any leverage to transform things. So we have to be creative. What we have to refuse, anyway, is no international order, anarchy, jungle, where just show of strength and assertive postures are defining the rules. This is not acceptable. And this would prove very dangerous. Because there you have, because that would not be done by respectable actors and predictable actors. It would be done by powers, but also by non-state actors, which would prove very destabilizing. So we have to be creative. I mean, from what does exist, which has not totally destroyed, we have to probably refresh, regenerate, recreate. But what we are advocating for is some kind of, I mean, this is also something very French probably, but some kind of regulation. We cannot just let show of strengths and assertive policies taking over the way world order is shaped. So we have to take into consideration some legitimate claims by newcomers, of course. We have to take into account some new realities. Look at what is happening in Syria, for example. I mean, here again we had some discussion, but the reality is reality. I mean, this is it. We lost. I mean, we Westerners, and for whatever reason, we did not put the means we wanted compatible with our objective. So this is it. Russia has the upper hand on what is going on. Iran has the upper hand on what is going on. So now you can make Iran an enemy, fine. But I mean, it does not dry out the reflection on how did we come to that point, and what are our failure as well. It's not just because they have an assertive policy. It's also because we failed in our own policy. So it's a bit too easy now to say to say, well, these guys are the bad guys, and they are there and they are acting contrary to our interest. Well, we helped them achieving this, by the way. So we have to think it over. So be creative. Try to engage as much as we can diplomatically to try to reshape what can be done, and probably there are some things which have to be given up, which will never work again. But it's not. It should not be a pretext for giving up any ambition to have some regulations, because multilateralism and legitimacy matters. And if we lose that, then we will have hard time ahead of us.
Thank you. I will maybe take the opportunity of my position as moderator to ask you one question, and then I really want to give the audience a chance to engage. So my question will be short and simple. In the foreword of the strategy, you didn't write it. It's Minister Pali, Minister for the Armed Forces, Pali, who wrote that. And I think that came as a surprise. And whereas you said that there were no surprises in this strategy, I think that was the main surprise that I felt, at least. She wrote, our alliances are changing. We can no longer be certain to count everywhere and always on our traditional partners. So, I was quite surprised by reading this, especially coming, in a strategy. It's not as if it's just a speech that is pronounced at one particular moment. It's in a strategy, i.e., do you identify, I guess the US in this particular case, as permanently drifting away, as permanently unreliable? What do you think of that?
I wouldn't say permanently, but I would say it's part of the unpredictability of the environment. And clearly what we see with this administration is a signal that, but I think it's even before that. I mean, the way it is expressed now is different. It's rougher, but it was already the case with the previous administration somehow. Look about Syria. When we were talking about Syria, it proved, a bit tricky. and France was left alone on something that was about to happen, and we were talking about allies. I mean, we could say the same with Turkey. Look at the evolution of the Turkish regime. Turkey is an ally within NATO. Do we share exactly the same interest? When we talk about NATO intervention, are we sure we want to make the defense of our interests depend on Turkish veto within NATO alliance at some point? This is a question. It remained theoretical at that point, luckily. But frankly speaking, if tomorrow we had to raise the issue, when I hear that NATO wants to engage in projecting stability and projecting counterterrorism things, fine, why not? On the principle, yes. But when we will come to the practical thing, it means in the southern flank, are we sure that we share exactly the same interest than with the Turks as they spell their interest now with Erdogan? I'm not sure. It's a question mark. I have no, and I don't want to prejudge. And I told you that we wanted in this review to be as objective as possible. But this is a question mark, and this is reflected in Mrs. Parley's speech. And that was, I think, this unpredictability is really, even for our best allies, is something we do experience in Europe. In Europe, when we look at the way the Europeans are now taking into consideration more seriously their defense, security, you have the defense budget on the rise again, you have some initiatives which are taken and so on. I would love to tell you that this new awareness was prompted by a clear conscience of the real threats around us. Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, Syria, Sahel, and so on. I'm not sure that's true. And I would even tell you that I do believe, because I live in this European community, I do believe, unfortunately, that what prompted these new initiatives at the European level were not the real security threats objectively depicted or assessed, but it was more political phenomenon like Brexit, Trump election, and things like this. And migration crisis in Germany, for example. These were traumas for the Europeans. Probably more than Ukraine invasion or Syria war. In my own country, your own country, in France, we didn't talk that much on TV about Ukraine invasion, annexation of Crimea, or even, I mean, the Syria war, yes, but it did not prompt reactions in terms of a security threat. Whereas, wow, Brexit was a kind of existential question, you know. Well, so we can undo this European Union we thought that would go forever. We have the Trump election was a big shock as well. So I think it had an impact. And so what can I say? I think, yes, it's part of this unpredictability of the partners, you know, that even those who are the closest to us, we do pretend we know the best. They can change. They can express sometimes different interests, urgencies. What is happening now in Germany, I wouldn't call it a serious political crisis, because there is in Germany a sense of the political stability that will lead the German political forces to an agreement. I'm sure of that, and I think in 3 months we'll be on a new course. But still, what happened in Germany is something. If we would have told a year from now that France would be seen as a strong man of Europe with a new guy almost unknown a year ago, pro-European, elected, and that Germany would be weakened by a political crisis. Nobody would have believed that. So this is unpredictability, volatility, and I think it can affect our best partners. So that's why we have to anticipate that as much as we can, and we have to assess that nothing is for granted forever, unfortunately.
Thank you. We are shortly running out of time, but I want to open to questions, especially perhaps coming from students. Please, if you have any questions. Well, if not, at least we'll finish on time. But I mean, I also actually have other questions. But.
Hi, I'm Lisa, along with and I was interested in Turkey. I was interested that when you think about questionable allies and things that comes to mind, and I'm wondering deal to buy the S-400 with Iran and Russia. Actual, there's no formal mechanism with it. Are there red lines that would be up?
Well, on this, I will answer on my own capacity. I'm not part of the French government or French authorities, so I'm only an MEP, individually speaking. To me, I mean, the Turkish attitude is not problematic. I mean, it's problematic for a long time already. I think ideologically we did not take into account something that was very present in. I mean, he designed it in a very clever way and pragmatic way for a long time. But I was always convinced that the core of the AKP under Erdogan and around Erdogan was quite a tough Islamist one. So it's not a real surprise, and I'm surprised that we are surprised, by the evolution of the regime. But anyway, yes, indeed, there are some short-term interest in dealing with the Syrian crisis that led him to go closer to Russia and Iran. It's quite understandable. There is probably some rationale in that. And I'm not sure that it will be a long-term strategic orientation. I think it's very much due to this Syrian crisis. There might not be a back to normal after, but I'm not sure that it will shape the whole Turkish foreign policy for the decade to come. So there are conjunctural calculation as well, and especially due to the Kurdish factor. Having said that, within NATO so far, I don't think there have been moves so detrimental to the organization itself. And from what I was told by NATO officials within NATO themselves, things are continuing as if nothing has happened, I would say. And we try and we succeed so far to preserve the common interest of the NATO alliance with our Turkish partners. What would be so there is a lot of rhetoric, there is a lot of domestic also positioning. What would be red lines? I think if it happened to materialize, the A400, S400, sorry, that would be something problematic. But more than that, the real test case would be, and I don't think it will happen anytime soon anyway, but the test case will be if there was to be a NATO deployment somewhere, and the Turkish would oppose because they would consider that contrary to their interest. And since NATO has some ambition in the south, we cannot exclude that, because at some point the groups we would face in some countries in the south are groups that are not would not be portrayed as enemy or adversaries by Ankara. So that would be the most problematic issue, but it's theoretical so far, and luckily so. I mean, and I hope we can continue. I mean, Turkey is very important. I don't like the way Turkey is behaving with us when it comes to this kind of blackmail, permanent blackmail. If you don't deliver with us on this, we will send you migrants, because that's exactly what's happening. And to put pressure on that way, I mean, it's not very constructive. But it works in a way that they stick to their words. I mean, they said they would respect the agreement Europe has with them, and they do respect it. So, but the process is not the one that should exist between real allies and partners. Another problematic issue, I think, is this European Union membership. Everybody knows that it will not happen. Nobody has the courage. Sarkozy had courage at that time. Merkel somehow to say, look, it will not happen. So let's be clear, it will not happen. Let's find another way. The problem is the Turks never wanted to disconnect concrete steps that could be taken to improve our relations from this grand strategy and goal to be member of the European Union. So we couldn't have any pragmatic approach towards Cyprus, to progress with a privileged partnership, which is crucial, vital. I mean, we have to away with Turkey. I mean, where they are, we need them. So I'm in favor of a close relationship with Turkey, but not at any cost. And the cost we pay now is in this very ambiguous process we keep with Erdogan, and this problematic.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the room, in the audience?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good question, and a tough one. I would send you to the 169 page, the famous one, with this thing, which is supposed to sum up the different scenarios for each capability, how we see that from the industry and technological point of view. It's 69, not 169, sorry, it's 69, page 69. Which capability, which modality? Is it in cooperation? Is it in full sovereignty, and so on? Again, on this issue, I think we should be very pragmatic, which means it has to be any consolidation. And it will happen. It has to happen anyway. But any consolidation in the industry, in defense industry, in Europe and in France, has to be program-driven. I don't think we can do what we love in France, which is mécano-industriel. You know, you just from the top decide that you will merge this unit with this unit, this industry with this industry, and then we will see what they do. But we have to do that because it's rational. It never really worked. What does work is you have priorities in terms of programs, and then you define who does what with a clear governance, which does not lead automatically to merge or to consolidate in terms of you create a new unit, but at least you have to tell clearly who does what for what kind of program. That's the only way. But even with this approach, very pragmatic approach, the difficulty is a social one. Because even when you have a rationale on having two companies coming together, you took the example of a French and a German one for ground forces and ground equipments. It sounds logical somehow, but ultimately we still face problems. We face two problems, by the way. Who will do what? Because the social cost will be that one country, one industrial unit will be sacrificed, and you have workers and you have families, and I still don't know any politician in France or in Germany ready to go and to say, look, we're going to close down your factory because it will be done by the other country. And that's the way it is. Socially and politically, not that easy. So that's the first difficulty. If we manage to overcome this difficulty, another one does exist in Europe, and especially between France and Germany, export question. Export is, there are some common rules at the European Union level, but there are national processes. And the German regime, for example, is so strict when it comes to some countries that it would prevent some industries to have a common approach on exports. And it worries a lot, not only the French industrials, but also the Germans. You would be surprised by the number of German industrial CEOs coming to Brussels and telling me, look, with the German regime, we cannot do anything. And that's problematic for us. So these are, I do not want to exaggerate this issue, but these are some problems we face when it comes to how to organize the defense industry. But it will have to move anyway. But I would recommend a very pragmatic approach. I think there are a lot of domains in which we will remain, and it's clearly said here, fully sovereign, because it is linked to nuclear deterrence, nuclear dimension. We want to keep 100% independence or autonomy on that. Then you have cooperation with keeping some competencies in France, which is required, but you have also cooperation with mutual dependency. So we have spelled out some categories. I mean, it's not something which is strict, and we will stick to that. It's only, I would say, somehow experimental, but at least we pushed a lot our procurement agency to deliver on that and to say, look, cooperation is not a bad word. Cooperation is something you will have to do anyway on many segments. So it's better for you to try to figure out what can happen and to try to anticipate. So we will see how it materializes. I can tell you that it's highly problematic already, and almost 100% of the phone calls I had after the review were just linked to one page, this one. The way we qualify Russia, China, no, everybody agrees you have a good approach, it's pragmatic. This thing, how? Is it purple? Is it green? And my missile, are they designed in this case or in this one? So everybody was just wondering, where are we here? And trying to figure out how many millions it cost to be in this. But I had to explain that it was not fixed forever, and that it's just once again it's an objective, and we want to accustom our decision makers and industrials to have this openness and to anticipate moves that will prove indispensable anyway in the defense industry, in European defense industry.
Thank you very much. Okay, one last question, and then we're going to have to conclude.
It's a good question. To be honest with you, I was a bit skeptical from the very beginning with this Sangaris operation. Actually, I don't think we had any choice. Something bad was happening there. We had troops already there, so it was difficult for France to avoid an intervention or to make as if nothing was happening and to just look elsewhere. So we had to intervene. My concern, though, was that we did it a bit reluctantly, for obvious reason. It's a difficult place. If you want to bring back stability in such a devastated place, you need so much time, so much resources, that it was obvious from the very beginning that the limited scope of our actions, military action, would not be enough. So we needed to find partners. So it was the UN and African Union with the MINUSCA. The MINUSCA from the very beginning as well was contested somehow. We had problem with the mandate. We had problem with the fourth generation, with the countries participating. Not all of them were neutral in that place. We withdrew, and as you mentioned, instability is still there. It's even gaining pace. I would be quite reluctant to have French forces intervening again, because this is precisely the case we face, where military intervention will prove again and again unsatisfactory, because we will limit, probably we will avoid the worst case scenario for limited time, but then it's not sustainable. So these are other mechanisms, complex one, in terms of governance, in terms of implication of regional actors. So there must be ownership and by local actors much more than we have. I would not recommend French troops to be deployed again in Central Africa. It's easier for me to say. I have no responsibility, so I can say that. Maybe if I was in power and I would be under pressure to act, maybe I would do that. But this is very problematic, because unfortunately for Central Africa, I'm not sure that, contrary to Sahel, for example, and contrary to Mali, I'm not sure that we can say that Central Africa is key for our security interest. It's a tragedy for this country. But I could see that it's not my judgment. It's the perception when you talk to other Europeans. We wanted to Europeanize the intervention in Central Africa. We managed somehow, because we have a small European force deployed, and we have now a European mission for training the Central African soldiers. But it's very limited, it's very modest. Talking to all other Europeans, they would tell you In Mali, we understood why you intervene, and there was a security interest even for Europe, and probably we, other Europeans, we should have come with you earlier and more massively, and we are ready to help because it's common interest. Central Africa. I mean, most of the European countries did not even know that it exists, where to put it on the map, and what was at stake. What is at stake in Central Africa is humanitarian crisis. But unfortunately, not very much interaction with security interests, properly speaking, for us. And other Europeans would tell you, Central Africa, yes, why not? But then Sudan, Southern Sudan, it's even more tragic than Central Africa. And then we have a problem. There we have a problem because it will be very difficult to have other Europeans participating to any mission, I mean, substantial mission to Central Africa. So it has to be dealt with by regional actors. So we have to involve regional actors. We can help, maybe we can, France has probably a role to play, but we have to be very cautious also because I'm from a generation which does not live with the ghost of the past, I would say. I don't feel responsible for what has happened in this part of the world 50 years ago when I was not even born. But the neo-colonial prejudice is still strong. So we have to be very cautious with what we do in these countries. And it has to be on their request for very well-designed missions. Otherwise, we will be... it can backfire very easily. And you know, we had this sexual scandal affecting the legitimacy of our operation. You know, legitimacy of the operation is just not about the international law mandate. It's about rumors now. Rumors that one soldier has behaved badly that can affect the whole legitimacy of the whole operations and prevent you from intervention for decades. So, you know, it's very complicated. So, unfortunately, I'm not sure that we are in the best place to formulate any advice for Central Africa intervention. I would be rather cautious on that.
Mr. Danj, thank you very much. We're going to have to bring this meeting to an end because I understand you have another meeting and we're already well over time. Again, thank you so much for joining us today at SAIS and congratulations for this amazing work. And thank you so much, Frank, for joining us for this conversation today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and I look forward to other conversations in the future.
Thank you. My apologies for my poor English.